Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, November 10th, 2022. A leader in a conservative House Republican caucus expresses some skepticism that the current House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, and his bid for House Speaker is a done deal. That bid was launched even as vote counting continues in a few dozen House races, so knowing which party will have the majority in the House in the end is not yet settled. Coming up, we'll talk about all this with a HuffPost reporter. Senate control also still up in the air a few days after Election Day. 3 Senate seats not called in Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, and Georgia already determined to be going to a runoff election in December. We'll hear from a Georgia Public Broadcasting political reporter on what to expect with that. Inflation report from the Labor Department: prices increased in October at a 7.7% annualized rate. That is down from September's 8.2%. Reaction on Wall Street: stocks jump 1,200 points. President Joe Biden is heading to Egypt for the United Nations Climate Summit, and then in a couple of days on to Indonesia for the G20 meeting, which includes a one-on-one get-together with the Chinese President Xi Jinping there first. We'll get a preview from the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi already at the UN Climate Summit with a congressional delegation, all Democrats. She talks about what it will take to convince a possible Republican-controlled U.S. House to make climate change a priority. And in Ukraine, Russian forces reportedly begin to leave the strategic city of Kherson as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urges caution, telling his country, "The enemy does not give us gifts, does not make goodwill gestures. We win it all." This from Politico.com. Members of the House Freedom Caucus have presented the House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy with demands to get their votes for his race for Speaker, assuming the Republicans do come away with majority when all the votes are counted. Those demands include naming a member of the Freedom Caucus to a senior leadership position and changes to some House rules that would help them. Congressman Andy Biggs, Republican from Arizona, is a past chair of the Freedom Caucus. He was interviewed on the podcast The Absolute Truth with Emerald Robinson. It was posted Wednesday. The clip with him begins with a clip of another Republican House member, Greg Steube of Florida.
I think, that we're going to have those elections next week. Leader McCarthy has raised more money than anybody, been all over the country doing everything he can to support the Republican conference. I haven't even heard of anybody else running against him. Even Jim Jordan supports him, so I don't see how McCarthy doesn't win the Speaker's race next week.
Sounds like it's pretty solid that McCarthy will continue to be the leader of the Republican caucus. Do you agree?
I would say maybe not so fast. Maybe we should have a good discussion within the confines of our internal body. Look, we were told we were going to have an incredible wave. And if that would have been the case, 20, 30, 40 seat margin, anywhere in there, you would say, well, okay, Kevin's the presumptive Republican nominee for Speaker. But I think we need to have a serious discussion. He's backpedaled on things like impeachment, and in some ways that indicates a willingness to be weakening the oversight authority that we need to have and the leverage points we need to have in order to deal with a Democrat president. And if you want to just take a look at that, one of the great big issues that we had was the National Defense Authorization Act, where we had leverage over the Democrats because they couldn't get across, and our leadership didn't leverage that to remove the vax mandates, for instance. I don't understand why this is just a foregone conclusion. I think we have to have a real discussion and see how people respond to the ultimate results of this election and get a feel for what his agenda and what he thinks he's going to accomplish. Because I will tell you, Emerald, if we're going to go in for 8 months of performance art instead of really getting things done, then we will fail in preparing for a 2024 election where we have to win to get the White House, the Senate, and the House back.
Congressman Andy Biggs, Republican from Arizona, Freedom Caucus member, on a podcast from Wednesday. Arthur Delaney is a senior reporter for HuffPost, has been following Congressman Kevin McCarthy's run for Speaker, joining us now by phone. Thank you so much. Before we get to some of the issues, what's the math here? The projected possible final House Republican majority and the number of Freedom Caucus members and other Republicans who might be balking.
Well, they could wind up with a House majority as small as a one-member cushion. We don't know how it's going to shake out, and it could take weeks because of those slow elections in California. But this potentially could be as small a majority as you could possibly have. I mean, it's still theoretically possible as of Thursday afternoon that Democrats retain their majority, though I think most people consider that unlikely. But no matter what, McCarthy's going to have he's going to be in a tough spot. I think the higher range of seats they could win would give him something like maybe a 10-seat padding. And the Freedom Caucus controls – I mean, they don't control it. The Freedom Caucus consists of 36, maybe 40 members. So they are a sizable bloc, and they have thrown their weight around plenty of times in the past, and we're familiar with the dynamic. Reporters on Capitol Hill are, and so we can see what's going to happen and how much trouble they're going to be able to give McCarthy.
What specifically does the Freedom Caucus not like about Kevin McCarthy's positions?
It's not so much that they don't like Kevin McCarthy's positions. I mean, right now it seems like they're frustrated by the outcome of the midterm election and blaming him for that. But it's not his fault that the Supreme Court threw out the federal right to abortion, and that overpowered, the Republican advantage on the economy. Kevin McCarthy didn't make that happen. Though there has been some griping about whether he interfered in Republican primaries in order to give himself a more loyal conference. But what they're mad about right now is just that the election didn't go so great. But they've always wanted more power for rank and file members, more power for conservative Republicans such as themselves. And the way the House has worked, it's been tightly controlled by the Speaker. So they've had a letter of demands for rules changes that would empower individual members, such as a rules change that would allow anyone to try to vacate the chair, which is essentially throw out the Speaker. They want more ability to amend legislation, is another prime example, and they want him to commit to only bring legislation to the floor if there's a majority of the Republican majority supporting it. These are all things that Kevin McCarthy really doesn't want because they would make his life much more difficult.
Kevin McCarthy formally launching his bid. How has he put out his rationale, and how has he done it? Is it written? Has he said something on camera? His rationale for being Speaker.
Oh, he sent everybody a 2-page letter yesterday, and first of all he said, look, I know we didn't win yet, but we're gonna win, and he mentioned some races that he's confident will go their way, and then he actually talked about the election as a historic victory, even though it's not one. But he said that it has been rare in past 100 years or so for a minority party to retake the House after they were only in the minority for 4 years. So that was his claim to success. And he basically said, look, I'll be a listener. I think that's a key line from him because that actually does speak to the way that he operates. He is very solicitous of members, and Freedom Caucus members have told me that is what they like about him. Remember, he got in some hot water this year when a recording of him bashing Donald Trump came out after he had denied that it exists, and he lied very brazenly about not having said things that he actually did say. And the Freedom Caucus loves Donald Trump, so they didn't like that, but he went to them and was able to spin it in a way that they liked, and some of them even gave him a standing ovation. and so it's possible that he will be able to finagle his way out of the jam he's in and ascend to Speaker without getting too much trouble from the Freedom Caucus guys. But they do seem real mad right now.
We're talking with Arthur Delaney from HuffPost. Congressman Kevin McCarthy went through this once before a couple of years ago when Speaker Boehner left. Has anything changed since then?
Right, and so it's the same dynamic where the Freedom Caucus was like, look, we've got some demands if you want us to support you, and Kevin McCarthy at that time was like, I don't think I want to be Speaker bad enough to put up with this. But he's a different guy now. He has embraced that much more solicitous, friendly, listening approach, and he's also a great fundraiser, and he spreads his campaign money around to Republican campaigns. So he's, I believe, much better liked by the Republican conference, including by Freedom Caucus members. And another thing to keep in mind is it's not clear how unified the Freedom Caucus is. We heard from Andy Biggs, and he's a very senior member. We've heard from Bob Good, who's starting his second term, and he's been very critical of Kevin McCarthy this week. But we don't know if they speak for everybody. And Freedom and when that Trump bashing tape came out, they told me that they didn't all love his response, but they didn't all hate it either. Olivia Beavers at Politico has done some good reporting about how there's fractiousness within the Freedom Caucus, because 40 or so members is a lot of people. So it's not exactly clear how cohesive they can be in their efforts to oust McCarthy. But if they have a tiny majority, it's only going to take a few guys. So really the Freedom Caucus is just like a symbol of how difficult it will be to have a small Republican majority.
Arthur Delaney, senior correspondent for HuffPost. Find his work at HuffPost.com, and on Twitter it's at Arthur Delaney HP. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
As for the House Democratic leadership, Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said in the past that this would be her last term as party leader, but she's not spoken about this since Tuesday's elections, whether that still holds true. And the current House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer and Majority Whip James Clyburn also not commenting yet, while the final totals in the House are still undecided, and that could determine their future. The three have led the House Democrats for about 2 decades. There was a question today about their future to Elaine Kamarck, director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution, an event hosted by the institution.
There have been a lot of conversations over the past couple of years about a need for new blood in Democratic leadership. The president, a Democrat, will celebrate his 80th birthday this month. The top 3 House Democrats are all over the age of 80. Do you think that the results of Tuesday night change that conversation within the Democratic Party, or does it give a greater lead for some of the older we'll say the Democratic elder statesmen to continue in their leadership roles?
I think that the way I would look at it is as follows: if the gerontocracy, as they've been called, decides that maybe it's time to go, this is probably a good year, because in fact they just had a big win. It's always nice to leave when you're on top. And one of the reasons that, of course, Pelosi and the rest of the leadership team stayed on and was elected in the last 2 go-rounds was because Trump was around and they needed to impeach Trump. He was president first. They needed to impeach him. They needed some people with some experience to do this and get this through. So I think this is really going to be up to them personally, because in fact if they're going to be in the minority for 2 years, maybe that's not so much fun, but we do have Joe Biden in the White House, and he can stop anything really awful from happening by using his veto power. So who knows? I think this is up to them. I think all of them would get reelected to their leadership posts, especially after this year. If they ran, they would get reelected. But I think at this point, it is really going to be a set of personal decisions. And I think the same thing is for Biden. Bell Sawhill, one of our economists here, once told me that The funny thing about aging is that, when you're in your 40s or your 50s, there's a lot of people in the middle, right? And who are more or less the same. And then as you get older, that graph flattens out. And you get a lot of people who are very ill and really can't function. But you got people who are Nancy Pelosi, who stood in the Congress for 8 hours in 4-inch heels. I can't stand for 30 seconds in 4-inch heels. 8 hours in 4-inch heels and read out the names of the dreamers. Okay, now she's a phenomenon. She happens to be 82 years old, but she's still going strong. The same can be said of the rest of the leadership team. The same can be said of Joe Biden, okay, who does this incredibly difficult job. So, I think that you have to understand that there's 80-year-olds and there's 80-year-olds, and this will be up to them to make that decision.
Elaine Kmark is director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution, part of a panel with other pundits looking at the midterm elections. It was held by Brookings. We covered it, and you can find the full video at our video library at cspan.org. Speaker Pelosi today was in Egypt at the United Nations Climate Summit, leading a delegation. Reuters reports it this way. U.S. Democratic lawmakers at the UN Climate Summit in Egypt expressed concern on Thursday that Republican gains in the midterm congressional elections could spell trouble for America's efforts to fight climate change. Kathy Castor, the chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, told an audience at the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh on Thursday that if Republicans take control of Congress, it could reduce the chances for additional legislative action to fight global warming. And speaking on the same panel, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi criticized lawmakers who disagree global warming is a real problem and said Democrats and Republicans would have to work together to combat climate change. That from Reuters. Here's a portion of Speaker Pelosi's remarks.
We want to proceed with respect, to not be menacing to those that we need to win over, but to show them a path and how it is in all of our interests. And that doing that, we have to listen to them. We, as the United States of America, hope, as Kathy has said earlier, that with what we're doing technologically and all the rest, that can be a resource to these countries as well. But our president has asked for more money for the countries, for us to recognize that funds are needed globally. We have responsibilities. We've made commitments. And again, we invited your entire committee, Democrats and Republicans, but none of them came, or well, unless they're going to surprise us. But we have 2 planes that have come, and so far we haven't had any of them. But we really need to convince them that none of us is protected from this unless all of us is protected from it. That's not a values-based, it's a pragmatic-based reason, but in fact, for the children, we have to save all of the children. And these countries, when we were in Spain, when we were in Madrid, we were talking to the Conference of the Vulnerable Countries, and it was urgent then. It was urgent in Copenhagen. It's long overdue. So we cannot just have any political disagreement or the power of the fossil fuel industry cramping our style as we go forward with this, but to show a path that gets us to where we need to be. And we're good enough, the need is great enough, and the urgency is clear enough.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, on a panel hosted by the Atlantic Council on the sidelines of the UN Climate Summit in Egypt. Sitting beside her, Congresswoman Kathy Castor, Democrat of Florida, chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, who told Reuters after this event that the Democratic House and Senate, lame duck, will work to push through an appropriations bill that could release aid pledged by the Biden administration to help poor countries adapt to climate change. At cspan.org/election, you can find the results of every House and Senate and governor's election this year. The U.S. House now standing at 209 Republicans, 189 Democrats. That means about 36 seats yet to be called. And in the Senate, it's 49 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and exactly 3 races undetermined in Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, winning a close re-election himself, announced just yesterday over Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. Senator Johnson interviewed Wednesday night on Newsmax TV about his race and how the Republicans did overall.
I think we've always been a very evenly divided state, and it's very polarized. And you have hard support on both sides, probably about 47, 48%. Hard support for the left, 48% hard support for the right. And you're literally starting an election battling over about 4% of the electorate. And so it's difficult. And it's even more difficult for conservatives when you have a very liberal mainstream media, in my case, that literally tried to politically destroy me for 2 years prior to the election.
Right. I guess my thinking was that I'd never imagined somebody like Mandela Barnes coming out of Wisconsin. It seemed like that was a little bit far to the left for the taste there. I wanted to get your midterm diagnosis of what we saw last night and what you think. Obviously, there's still a couple races, Nevada, Arizona, that could go Republicans' way, possibly in Arizona. But how do you diagnose it?
Well, first of all, it's very disappointing. I don't think anybody on our side of the aisle would say anything but that. The question I'm asking is how bad do conditions have to get in this country before Democrat voters wake up and realize that their policies and the governance of their Democrat leaders is literally destroying this country? I mean, you've got 40-year high inflation, record gas prices, skyrocketing crime, an open border, a flood of deadly drugs. I just call that as the list of horribles. Mm-hmm. It doesn't get much worse than that, and yet Democrats just kind of shrugged it all off, and apparently a bunch of them did vote on the issue of abortion. It's there's so many factors going to these elections. It's hard to pin just one particular factor. It's multifaceted.
Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, interviewed on Newsmax Wednesday night. One of the undecided Senate races in Georgia has not yet been certified, even though it's heading to a runoff. That is between incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock and Republican challenger Herschel Walker. It could be another week or so before that certification takes place, but we do know when the runoff election is going to be. That's on December 6th, and the campaigning for that has already started. The runoff necessary because under Georgia law, neither of the top two candidates in that race got over 50%. A third-party candidate whose votes caused the two to drop below 50 is a libertarian. And C-SPAN asked Georgia Public Broadcasting political reporter Stephen Fowler about how the people who voted for that candidate might now vote in the runoff election.
Chase Oliver is the libertarian, garnering about 2% of the vote in the Senate race. Where is it expected that his voters go?
Well, there are some people that vote for the Libertarian candidate because they prefer the Libertarian candidate. It's unclear whether those people will support Herschel Walker or Raphael Warnock or just not vote. Now, the reason Chase Oliver got about 2% in this election is there is a sizable number of Republican voters in Georgia that do not want to vote for Herschel Walker. They do not like him. They do not think he's fit to be a senator, but they will not vote for Raphael Warnock. And so we saw with the pre-election polling, a considerable number of Republicans saying they would launch a protest vote for Chase Oliver. So those voters, they might just stay home. They might vote for Warnock, but it's very unlikely that many of those voters go back to Herschel Walker because basically not voting for Walker was the primary reason they chose to cast that ballot. And in the governor's race, Brian Kemp received about 53% of the vote. Herschel Walker finished about 5% behind that, meaning that really 1 in 10 Republican voters in Georgia said that they were going to vote for anyone but Herschel Walker. That's a considerable amount and why we're in this runoff situation.
And then the question about spending and more ads on Georgia Voters TV. Do we have a sense of how much was spent in the general election so far and how much more is likely to be spent over the next 4 weeks?
Oh, I mean, it's a good day to be a television station owner in Georgia. I'll tell you that much, because hundreds of millions of dollars between the campaigns, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the Senate Majority Project, and all of these outside groups, really Georgia has been blanketed with ads and mailers and surrogates and everything really for almost the past 4 years because it's become such a battleground state. And we've seen early reporting so far that Republicans are doing whatever it takes to pour the money in to get Herschel Walker elected. There's also, I saw on Twitter last night, Senator John Ossoff from Georgia was rallying other senators to share fundraising links to check in and have people raise money for Warnock. And so the fact that Georgia has this runoff in December and once again has a Senate race undecided, while everybody else should have the answers, means you've got an outsized money, outsized attention, and really just outsized pressure on these campaigns to deliver votes for their respective sides.
How do these campaigns plan to spend their time over the next 4 weeks? And is there any chance there might be another debate here before the runoff?
Well, we're already seeing campaigning happening. I mean, the dust is not even settled. The election's not even certified. It's still election week. And already Herschel Walker is campaigning with Texas Senator Ted Cruz this afternoon in a Republican exurb that would be a key part of him winning the runoff. And so we're already seeing campaign events happen. Strategists and operatives barely had 15 minutes to rest before getting back to work. We've seen a massive ground game in Georgia on the Republican side, spearheaded by Governor Brian Kemp, who's kind of stepped in place of the state party. And that activation will probably happen on the Democratic side since Stacey Abrams lost the governor's race. She's got a lot of time on her hands, and she's got a lot of dedicated supporters and followers and grassroots organizers that will stay ready for Raphael Warnock. So we're already seeing the campaigning happen. It wouldn't be surprised if you see new ads rolling out soon. As far as the debate, that seems unlikely. There was a large saga over the summer of Raphael Warnock accepting 3 different debates, one in Atlanta, one in Macon, one in Savannah, Herschel Walker not accepting those, then proposing his own 4th debate, and Warnock eventually agreeing to that. So with this tight timeline and with really the reaction that the debate had for both candidates, Herschel Walker touted his debate and said it was a victory and it helped him. Warnock said it helped show how Walker was out of touch and not ready. But I mean, that's valuable time and energy not spent getting out the vote, not spent rallying. And I think it would be a very long shot to see a debate, though in Georgia, anything's possible.
Stephen Fowler is a political reporter with Georgia Public Broadcasting, joining C-SPAN's Washington Journal this morning. A story from Politico: the logistics of the 2022 runoff will look different than 2021 after the Republican-controlled Georgia legislature passed a law last year that significantly changed the rules. Most notably, legislators shortened the runoff period from 9 weeks to 4 weeks. The new law also restricted early voting during the runoff and essentially eliminated the ability to register new voters during that period, which Democrats had used to great effect in 2021. Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden attending a rally hosted by the Democratic National Committee at Howard University in Washington, D.C. today to thank campaign volunteers. First, the Vice President.
As we gather here, votes are still being counted, but it is clear your work sent a message to the entire world. Our democracy is intact. And when democracy is intact, this is what it looks like. And here's the thing, some Democrats won and some Republicans won. That is what happens when more than 100 million Americans participate and vote in free and fair and open elections.
Vice President Kamala Harris at the DNC event in Washington today. President Biden also talking about how democracy was a good day for democracy on Election Day. And he talked about working with an increased number of Republicans in Congress.
Look, I also think the American people sent a message that they want us to work together. I've always done that. I know I got criticized for it when I ran. I said I was running for 3 reasons. 1, to restore the soul of America. 2, to build this economy from the middle out and the bottom up. And thirdly, to unite the country. Regardless of what the final tally showed, I'm prepared to work with Republicans. But the American people have made it clear. They expect Republicans to work with me as well. And folks, I'll always be open to any good ideas, whether it's Democrat or Republican, to move the country forward. But I've also made it really clear that if Republicans try to repeal the power we just gave Medicare to reduce prescription drug costs, I will veto it and let it happen. If Republicans try to walk away from the historic commitment we just made to deal with the climate crisis, I will not let that happen. If Republicans try to cut Social Security and Medicare, I will not let that happen. And if they try to cut taxes for the super wealthy again, the biggest corporations like they did in the last administration, I will not let that happen either.
President Joe Biden at Howard University in Washington, D.C., a thank you for campaign volunteers hosted by the Democratic National Committee. From CNN Business, stocks soared Thursday after new economic data showed that price increases eased in October. Investors cheer the development because it indicates the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes may finally be cooling inflation. The Dow up 1,201 points, NASDAQ up 760, S&P up 207. Consumer inflation was 7.7% higher in October versus a year earlier. That is down from the 8.2% in September. A separate measure called core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy costs, rose 6.3% in the past 12 months and 0.3% from September. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Friday on C-SPAN Radio at 11 a.m. Eastern, Veterans Day at the Arlington National Cemetery. First Lady Jill Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff take part in the ceremony to honor those who've served in the U.S. Armed Forces. Live Friday on C-SPAN Radio. You can listen on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or on your smart device. Say, play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. President Biden starting a trip overseas tonight, first to Egypt for the UN Climate Summit, then to Cambodia for the East Asian Leaders Conference, and then on to Indonesia for the G20 Leaders Meeting. And at the G20, President Biden plans to meet one-on-one with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre putting out a written statement saying the two leaders will discuss efforts to maintain and deepen lines of communication between them and to responsibly manage competition and work together where our interests align, especially on transnational challenges that affect the international community. More on this from the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan at today's White House briefing.
Later in the day on Monday, President Biden will hold a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. This is the first time that President Biden and President Xi will have this is the first time that they will meet face-to-face since President Biden became president. President Biden has made it a priority to keep lines of communication open with President Xi, to responsibly manage the competition between our two countries, and he believes there is no more important channel than that between the leaders of the United States and China. From day one of the Biden administration, our approach to the PRC has followed the same fundamentals. Invest in the foundations of our strength here at home, align our efforts with a network of allies and partners, and compete responsibly to defend and advance our interests and those of like-minded nations. The meeting between President Biden and President Xi will be an in-depth and substantive opportunity to better understand one another's priorities and intentions, to address differences, and to identify areas where we can work together. Because working together to address common problems is in our interest, and because it is what the world expects of responsible powers.
The National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in the White House briefing room, part of his opening statement. Some of the topics expected in the meeting between President Biden and President Xi include trade and Taiwan and China's relationship with Russia, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine. One of the reporters today asking about some of those issues.
So I wanted to ask two questions about the meeting with President Xi. One, yesterday the president did not commit to telling President Xi that they would, or the U.S. would, defend Taiwan militarily. How should Taiwan be interpreting that answer? And secondly, the Treasury released a report today saying that or criticizing China for not being more transparent about its foreign exchange policy, and explicitly calling it a failure. Will the two leaders speak about that tomorrow as well?
So on your first question, as many of you know, having seen President Biden go into consequential meetings with foreign counterparts, he doesn't like to characterize what he's going to say to them. He likes to actually go say it to them. And as for how Taiwan might react to that, we'll have the opportunity as an administration to brief Taiwan on the results of that meeting. And I'm confident that they will feel very secure and comfortable in the United States' position when it comes to our support for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and our commitment to the Taiwan Relations Act, which does commit the United States to ensuring we're providing the articles for Taiwan's defense. Yeah. Oh, and you asked about the FX report. I would just say that this has been a longstanding concern of the United States. It's been reflected in previous reports. It doesn't come as a significant surprise, but it is an area of significant concern for the United States. And I can't tell you standing here today whether that particular topic will come up among the wide range of things we have to discuss with the PRC.
The National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in the White House briefing room. The Russian embassy in Indonesia confirming that Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be traveling to Bali to take part in next week's G20 summit. Instead, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, will head the Russian delegation. AFP reports that the embassy saying President Putin's program is still being worked out. He could participate virtually. White House today also announcing another military aid package for Ukraine in its war against Russia's invasion. $400 million for air defense systems mostly. And this comes amid reports that Russia's forces are starting to withdraw from the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his nightly address to his country Wednesday night, urging caution in case it's a ruse to lure Ukraine's military in for a battle that's favorable to Russia.
We are moving gradually, strengthening our position step by step. There is a lot of joy in the media space today, and it is clear why. But our emotions must be restrained, as they should be always during war. I will definitely not feed the enemy with all the details of our operations, either in the south, or in the east, or anywhere else. When we have our result, everyone will see it. For sure. Maybe it doesn't sound like what anyone expects now. Perhaps not as it sounds in the news. But you need to understand. No one just gets away if they don't feel the strength. The enemy does not bring us gifts, does not make gestures of goodwill. We fight our way up. And when you are fighting, you must understand that at every step there is always resistance from the enemy. It is always the loss of the lives of our heroes. Therefore, we move very carefully, without emotions, without unnecessary risk. In the interests of the liberation of our entire land and so that the losses are as small as possible. This is how we will secure the liberation of Kherson, Kakhovka, Donetsk, and other our cities. But this will be the result of our efforts, our defense operations, those that are currently ongoing, those that we are planning.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, part of his nightly speech, that was from Wednesday night, the audio from KyievPost.com. Back in the U.S., at the Pentagon, reporters asking the Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh about Russia's military movements.
You had mentioned you've seen some indications of movement in Kherson City. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is this movement since the announcement that the Russians are withdrawing from the city, and how many Russian forces are withdrawing?
So I wouldn't be able to characterize the number of Russians that we're seeing. I mean, all I can really say is we're seeing some indications of movement, and as I think you know, and we all saw, the Russians announcing that they were going to withdraw troops from Kherson City, but we're only just seeing some indications of that. I would say it's still, at least on our side, too early to make an assessment there. I'm going to take one more from the phone, and then I will come back into the room. Phil Stewart, Reuters.
Hey there, thanks. Real quick, General Milley made some comments yesterday, not just about the casualty count, but also about the need to take opportunities for peace when they come along. I'm wondering if you could articulate the Secretary's view on both the casualty numbers, whether they're sustainable for the Ukrainians, what they say about Russian tactics, and then also his views on, whether or not opportunities for peace need to be seized with some urgency. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Phil, for the question. I think it's important to remember, just taking a step back, that this war could end today or tomorrow. Vladimir Putin has the opportunity to end this war and to come to the table and frankly withdraw his troops from Ukraine. We don't see that happening. The president has said, the secretary has said that the way we see the end to this war is through diplomatic conversations. But again, we're not seeing that the Russians are willing to let up and frankly continue to see their aggression on the battlefield and in cities all across Ukraine. In terms of your other question on Chairman Milley's comments, I think I'd let those comments speak to themselves. I don't have anything further to add to that.
The Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh, referring to the question, refers to General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Story from CNN, Ukraine's military said it had retaken swaths of territory in Kherson on Thursday after Moscow ordered a partial withdrawal from the area, though officials in Kyiv warned that retreating Russian soldiers could turn the regional capital into a city of death on their way out. Concerning Brittany Griner, the U.S. basketball star serving a 9-year prison sentence in Russia for drug possession after cannabis oil was found in vape cartridges found in her luggage through a Moscow airport. State Department spokesman Ned Price today confirming that the U.S. was not given a heads up that she was being transferred to a penal colony. And at the White House, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan saying President Biden is personally engaged in discussions to try to free her, but Russia so far has not been responsive to offers of a prisoner swap with the U.S. Ned Price at the State Department also asked today about U.S. relations with Israel. The expected new government in Israel under returning Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not been formed yet, but today one of the new ruling coalition members making news, the Times of Israel writing that far-right leader Itamar Ben-Gvir was booed by attendants at a commemorative event Thursday night for the late racist Rabbi Meir Kahane after he expressed opposition to the most extreme and discriminatory ideas of his spiritual mentor. Here's the questions to the State Department spokesman Ned Price today.
It looks like the Internal Security Minister, the Police Minister, whatever his, Mr. Ben-Gvir, has gone and made a visit to the Kahane Memorial. And I'm just wondering, you guys have been loath to talk about this before a government has been formed, or talk about the new Israeli government before it has been formed, but I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that.
Well, of course, I'm not commenting on any government that hasn't yet been formed, but what I can say is that we've seen these same reports. Celebrating the legacy of a terrorist organization is abhorrent. There is no other word for it. It is abhorrent. And we remain concerned, as we said before, by the legacy of Kahane and the continued use of rhetoric among violent right-wing extremists. We've condemned incitement. We've condemned violence and racism in all of its forms. There is a good reason why Kahane remains designated as a specially designated global terrorist organization. We urge all parties to maintain calm, to exercise restraint, and to refrain from actions that only serve to exacerbate tensions, and that includes in Jerusalem.
But it's no longer an FTO, right?
My understanding is that it's still designated as an SGGT.
But it's no longer an FTO.
That is my understanding. That's correct.
State Department spokesman Ned Price, questioned by Matt Lee, reporter with the Associated Press. Ned Price today also, on behalf of the United States, congratulating Israel, along with Qatar, for a temporary agreement between the two countries. The two countries don't have diplomatic relations.
The United States congratulates FIFA, Israel, and Qatar on the historic step of opening direct flights between Tel Aviv and Doha for the duration of the World Cup, and commends the efforts that went into arriving at this arrangement. Today's announcement is a historic development and an important step that also holds great promise to bolster people-to-people ties and economic relations. As President Biden has said, building regional integration in the Middle East and beyond brings prosperity and security to the people of the region. We welcome the statement that this move will benefit Israeli and Palestinian soccer fans alike as a step towards expanding greater freedom of travel for all, consistent with Qatar's pledge that all are welcome at the World Cup. The United States will continue to engage with Israel and our partners across the region for the benefit of all. And we commend Qatar and Israel, both close partners of the United States, for their leadership and spirit of sportsmanship that they have demonstrated with this important development.
State Department spokesman Ned Price. The charter flights will be between Tel Aviv, Israel, and Doha, Qatar. The World Cup runs from November 20th to December 18th in Qatar. 32 teams, and Qatar is one of them as the host country. Israel is not among them. The U.S. is. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for daily stories that Washington is talking about, delivered right to your inbox. Subscribe by going to c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.